It was one of those crisp mornings at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the kind where the air feels fresh but carries a slight chill, and the buzz of travelers fills the space with energy. Among the crowd stood a tall man, in his late 40s, dressed sharply in a navy blue suit that looked like it had been tailored just for him. His salt and pepper hair gave him an air of authority, and his calm demeanor suggested he was someone who didn't get rattled easily. But there was something about him that most people around him wouldn't guess. This man wasn't your average traveler rushing to catch a flight. He was undercover, a federal auditor on a mission. His job? To investigate complaints of discrimination against airlines. And today, fate was about to hand him an experience that would become the centerpiece of his work. The man walked up to the gate for Flight 321, heading to New York City. He had booked a first-class seat, just as he always did for these trips. It wasn't because he wanted luxury. It was part of his strategy. Booking first class allowed him to observe how airline staff treated passengers differently based on their seating arrangements. Over the months, he'd seen enough to know that some patterns were hard to ignore. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. As boarding began, he stepped forward and handed his ticket to the gate attendant. She glanced at it briefly, then tapped on her computer screen. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then her expression shifted. She hesitated, looking back and forth between the man and her monitor. Finally, she spoke, her voice clipped and unapologetic. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, avoiding eye contact, "but your seat has been reassigned to economy." The man raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected this. "Reassigned?" he asked calmly. "Why is that?" The attendant mumbled something about overbooking, though her tone lacked conviction. She didn't offer any further explanation, nor did she meet his gaze. Instead, she handed him a new boarding pass and gestured toward the line for economy seating. The man took it without argument, though inside, he felt a mix of frustration and sadness. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, but it never got easier. He made his way to the back of the plane and found his assigned seat. As he settled in, he couldn't help but replay the scene in his mind. Why had the attendant acted so strangely? Was it really about overbooking, or was there something else at play? These weren't idle questions for him, they were central to his mission. Every interaction, every glance, every word carried meaning when you were trying to uncover bias. Sitting there, surrounded by strangers, the man allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about all the stories he'd heard during his travels. There was the young woman who was told her ticket was invalid even though she had proof of purchase. Or the businessman whose frequent flyer miles mysteriously vanished overnight. Each story painted a troubling picture of how people of color were treated differently in the skies. And now, here he was, experiencing it firsthand. But this wasn't just about personal indignation. This was bigger than him. It was about exposing a system that allowed such things to happen, and holding those responsible accountable. As the plane taxied down the runway, the man leaned back in his seat, already strategizing his next move. He knew this incident would be more than just another anecdote. It would be evidence. Evidence of a problem that needed fixing. And he was determined to see it through. For now, though, he kept his thoughts to himself. To the passengers around him, he was just another traveler, quietly enduring the discomfort of coach. They had no idea that beneath that calm exterior lay a resolve as strong as steel. A resolve to shine a light on injustice, no matter how deeply it was buried. The man sat in his economy seat, staring out the small oval window as the plane climbed higher into the sky. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly, a sea of white that seemed to go on forever. But inside his mind was racing. This wasn't just another frustrating experience. It was part of a much larger puzzle he'd been piecing together for months. Over the past 6 months, this auditor had traveled across the country, quietly gathering information about discrimination in the airline industry. His mission wasn't glamorous or flashy. It was methodical and deliberate. He had heard countless stories from passengers who felt they were treated unfairly because of their race. Some were brushed off by staff when they asked for help. Others were denied services that should have been available to everyone. And then there were those whose experiences went beyond inconvenience. They were dehumanizing. One story stuck with him more than others. A young woman, no older than 30, had shared how she was removed from a flight despite having a valid ticket. When she asked why, the airline staff couldn't or wouldn't give her a clear answer. She described feeling humiliated as other passengers watched her being escorted off the plane. Her voice cracked as she recounted the moment, saying, "It wasn't just about the seat. It was like I didn't belong there." Another case involved a businessman who had spent years building up his frequent flyer status. One day, without warning, his account showed 0 miles. When he contacted customer service, they claimed there was an error but offered no solution. The man suspected it wasn't a coincidence. He believed it was because of the color of his skin. These weren't isolated incidents. They were threads in a pattern, and the man was determined to pull them all together. As the flight attendants began making their rounds, offering drinks and snacks to first-class passengers, the auditor observed everything carefully. He noticed how they smiled warmly at the people up front, chatting casually and addressing them by name. But when they reached the back of the plane, their tone changed. Their movements became quicker, almost mechanical. There was none of the same warmth or attentiveness. It wasn't subtle, it was glaringly obvious. He decided to test the waters himself. When a flight attendant approached his row, he politely asked for a beverage typically reserved for premium passengers. "I'm sorry," she replied curtly, "but we don't serve that here." Her words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive. The auditor nodded, masking his frustration behind a calm expression. He didn't push further. Instead, he made a mental note of the exchange, storing it away along with the dozens of other observations he'd collected during the flight. Every detail mattered. Every interaction told a story. The way the flight attendants spoke, or didn't speak, to certain passengers. The way they lingered longer in some sections of the plane while rushing through others. Even the smallest gestures added up to something bigger. And as the hours passed, the picture became clearer. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was systemic bias, woven into the fabric of the airline's operations. By the time the plane touched down in New York, the auditor had gathered enough material to fill several reports. He carried his notes and recordings to his hotel room, where he spread them out on the desk. There were transcripts of conversations, photos of seating arrangements, and detailed descriptions of every incident he'd witnessed. He knew this wasn't just about one airline. It was about exposing a culture that allowed such behavior to persist. As he typed up his preliminary findings, he thought about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about holding one company accountable. It was about sending a message to the entire industry. People deserved to feel safe and respected when they traveled, regardless of their background. And if airlines refused to address these issues on their own, then it was up to someone like him to force the conversation. The auditor leaned back in his chair, letting out a deep breath. He was tired, but he also felt a spark of determination. Tomorrow he would meet with the airline's management and present his evidence. He knew it wouldn't be easy. People in power rarely liked being called out for their mistakes. But he also knew that change only happened when someone was brave enough to stand up and say, "This isn't right." For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought about the young woman who had been kicked off her flight, the businessman whose loyalty was ignored, and all the other voices he had listened to over the months. Their stories fueled him. They reminded him why he was doing this work, not for recognition or applause, but because it was the right thing to do. As he turned off the light and climbed into bed, the auditor knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. But he also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, brought him closer to justice. And that was worth fighting for. The next morning, the auditor woke up early. He didn't need an alarm clock. His mind had been racing all night, replaying the events of the previous day. The incident at the gate, the cold dismissal by the flight attendant, and the subtle but undeniable bias he'd witnessed on the plane. It was all fresh in his mind. He knew what he had to do next, but that didn't make the task any less daunting. After grabbing a quick breakfast, he headed back to the airport. This time, though, he wasn't traveling as a passenger. He was there in his official capacity. As he walked through the bustling terminal, he adjusted the lapel pin on his suit jacket, a small badge that marked him as a federal auditor. It was a symbol of authority, but also of responsibility. He carried it with pride, knowing that his work could lead to real change. When he arrived at the airline's office, he introduced himself to the regional manager. The woman behind the desk looked startled when she realized who he was. Her face went pale, and for a moment she seemed unsure of what to say. Finally, she gestured for him to take a seat. "How can I assist you?" she asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. The auditor didn't waste time. He pulled out his tablet and began presenting his findings. He started with the most recent incident, the one where he'd been denied his first-class seat despite having a valid ticket. He showed her the video footage he'd recorded discreetly during the flight. The footage captured everything: the dismissive tone of the gate attendant, the curt responses from the flight crew, and the stark contrast in how passengers were treated, based on their seating class. As the manager watched, her expression shifted from shock to discomfort. She tried to explain away the behavior, blaming overworked staff and outdated systems. But the auditor wasn't buying it. "These aren't isolated mistakes," he said firmly. "This is a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident." He then shared stories from other passengers he'd interviewed during his investigation. There was the elderly man who was ignored when he asked for assistance with his carry-on bag. The family of 4 who were split up across different sections of the plane, despite booking their tickets months in advance. The young professional who was repeatedly passed over when drinks and snacks were being served, while others around her received multiple refills. Each story painted a picture of a system that treated people differently, based on race, even if it wasn't always obvious. The manager listened quietly, occasionally nodding or scribbling notes, but the auditor could see the tension in her body language. She knew this wasn't just about one bad day or one rude employee. It was about something much deeper. Something systemic. To drive his point home, the auditor played another clip. This one showed a flight attendant laughing with a group of white passengers in first class, offering them extra amenities and chatting casually. Moments later, the same attendant breezed past the economy section without so much as a glance. The contrast was striking and damning. "This isn't just about customer service," the auditor said, leaning forward slightly. "It's about respect. People pay good money to fly with your airline. They deserve to be treated fairly no matter where they're sitting or what they look like. What I saw yesterday, and what I've seen over the past 6 months, is unacceptable." The manager nodded slowly, her earlier defensiveness giving way to resignation. "I understand," she said, "and I assure you we'll take immediate action to address these issues." But the auditor wasn't satisfied with promises. "Actions speak louder than words," he replied. "You can promise training programs and policy changes, but until we see real results, nothing will change. My department will be conducting a full audit of your operations. We'll be looking at everything: your hiring practices, your customer service protocols, your complaint resolution processes. Nothing will be off limits." The manager swallowed hard, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. She agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation, promising transparency and accountability. But the auditor knew better than to take her word at face value. Promises were easy to make, but keeping them was another story. As the meeting came to an end, the auditor packed up his materials and stood to leave. Before walking out, he turned back to the manager. "This isn't personal," he said. "It's about fairness. Your airline has a chance to set an example for the industry. Don't waste it." On his way out, the auditor felt a mix of emotions. Satisfaction, because he'd finally laid all the evidence on the table. Frustration, because he knew the fight wasn't over. And determination, because he was committed to seeing this through to the end. Back at his hotel room, he spent the rest of the afternoon organizing his notes and preparing for the next phase of the investigation. He uploaded the video footage and documents to a secure server, ensuring they were safely stored for future use. Then he drafted a detailed report for his superiors, outlining his findings and recommending specific areas for further scrutiny. As he worked, He thought about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one airline, it was about an entire industry that needed to do better. Airlines weren't just businesses, they were gateways to opportunity, connecting people to jobs, families, and dreams. When they failed to treat passengers with dignity and respect, they weren't just losing customers, they were perpetuating inequality. By the time he finished, the sun had set outside his window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world beyond this single case. The auditor leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. He knew the road ahead would be challenging. Change never came easily, especially when it required confronting uncomfortable truths. But he also knew that every step forward mattered. For now, he allowed himself a small moment of pride. He had done his job well, gathering evidence that couldn't be ignored. Tomorrow, he would continue the fight. Because in the end, it wasn't just about holding companies accountable, it was about creating a world where everyone could travel without fear of being treated unfairly. And that was a goal worth pursuing, no matter how hard the journey might be. The auditor's findings didn't stay hidden for long. Word of the investigation leaked to the press, and within hours it was everywhere. News outlets, social media, talk shows. The story spread like wildfire, sparking outrage across the country. People couldn't stop talking about it. Hashtags like #RarFlyWhileBlack and End Airline Bias started trending on Twitter, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment while flying. For years, many passengers had felt powerless, believing their voices wouldn't be heard. But now seeing someone in authority take a stand gave them hope. Stories poured in from all corners of the internet. A woman recounted how she was told her seat had been upgraded for another passenger, even though she had paid full price. A father described being separated from his child during boarding because the airline refused to honor their request to sit together. Another traveler shared how they were singled out for extra security checks, despite having flown with the same airline dozens of times without issue. Journalists reached out to the auditor, eager to get an exclusive interview. Cameras showed up outside his hotel, reporters shouting questions as he walked by. But the auditor stayed quiet. He wasn't there for fame or attention. His focus was on the investigation, not the spectacle surrounding it. Instead, he let the evidence speak for itself. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to control the damage. They issued a public apology, promising to do better. Their CEO appeared on morning TV, vowing to implement sweeping changes. "We are committed to ensuring that every passenger feels welcome and respected," he said, looking straight into the camera. "This is not who we are as a company." But the public wasn't convinced. Critics pointed out that apologies were easy. Real change was hard. Advocacy groups seized the moment, organizing protests outside major airports. Flyers held signs that read, "Respect us all," and "No more excuses." Lawmakers began drafting legislation aimed at holding airlines accountable for discriminatory practices. It seemed like the entire nation was waking up to a problem that had been simmering for years. Back at his hotel, the auditor watched it all unfold on the news. He felt a mix of emotions, pride, frustration, and a deep sense of responsibility. This was exactly what he had hoped for: a national conversation about fairness and equality in air travel. But he also knew that the fight was far from over. Apologies and promises were just the beginning. What mattered most was action. Over the next few days, the auditor met with victims of similar incidents, offering them guidance and support. Many of them had never spoken publicly about their experiences before, fearing retaliation or dismissal. But now, emboldened by the growing movement, they were ready to share their stories. The auditor listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. He wanted to ensure that every voice was heard, every experience validated. One meeting stood out in particular. A young woman came to see him, visibly nervous but determined. She explained how she had been removed from a flight after asking a simple question about her meal options. The staff accused her of being difficult, even though she had remained polite throughout the interaction. "I felt so small," she said, her voice trembling, "like I didn't matter." The auditor nodded, his expression soft but resolute. "You matter," he said firmly. "And your story matters. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on the airline mounted. Passengers began boycotting their flights, opting for competitors instead. Social media campaigns urged travelers to avoid the airline altogether. Revenue dropped sharply, and stock prices plummeted. For the first time, the company realized the true cost of ignoring complaints about discrimination. Behind the scenes, the auditor worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. He coordinated with advocacy groups, sharing data and insights to strengthen their arguments. He collaborated with lawmakers, helping them draft policies that would protect passengers' rights. And he continued documenting cases of bias, building an even stronger case against the airline. Through it all, he remained focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one company. It was about setting a precedent for the entire industry. If this airline could be held accountable, others would have no choice but to follow suit. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but every step forward brought them closer to justice. Late one evening, the auditor sat alone in his hotel room, scrolling through the latest headlines. The movement he had helped spark was gaining traction, inspiring people to demand better treatment not just in air travel, but in all areas of life. He felt a flicker of hope, knowing that his work was making a difference, but he also knew the road ahead would be long and challenging. Discrimination wasn't limited to airlines. It existed in schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and countless other spaces. Yet as he closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, he allowed himself a small smile. For the first time in a while, he felt optimistic. This case had proven that when people stood together, they could create change. And if they could do it here, they could do it anywhere. Tomorrow he would return to work, continuing the fight for fairness and equality, because in the end, it wasn't just about holding companies accountable. It was about creating a world where everyone could move freely, without fear of being treated unfairly. And that was a goal worth pursuing, no matter how hard the journey might be. Months had passed since the auditor's investigation first made headlines, and the ripple effects were still being felt across the country. The airline at the center of the controversy was scrambling to save its reputation. They rolled out glossy advertisements featuring smiling passengers from diverse backgrounds, promising a new era of inclusivity. But for many, the damage had already been done. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with a catchy slogan or a slick PR campaign. The Department of Transportation, DOT, released its official findings, confirming what the auditor had suspected all along. Systemic racial bias wasn't just an isolated problem within this one airline. It was a widespread issue affecting the entire industry. The report detailed patterns of discriminatory behavior, from seating assignments to customer service interactions. It highlighted how airlines often prioritized certain passengers over others based on race, class, and perceived status. The evidence was damning, and the public response was swift. Lawmakers wasted no time in responding to the DOT's findings. Congressional hearings were held, with representatives grilling airline executives about their practices. One senator summed it up bluntly: "This isn't just bad business, it's wrong, and we're going to make sure it stops." Bills were introduced aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in the airline industry. These included measures like mandatory diversity training for staff, stricter penalties for discriminatory practices, and the creation of an independent oversight board to handle passenger complaints. For the auditor, seeing these developments was both gratifying and sobering. On one hand, he was proud of the impact his work had made. His investigation had shone a light on a problem that had long been ignored, forcing companies and lawmakers to take action. On the other hand, he knew this was only the beginning. Laws and policies were important, but they couldn't change hearts and minds overnight. Real progress would require more than just rules. It would require a cultural shift. As the movement gained momentum, advocacy groups continued to play a crucial role. They organized rallies, town halls, and workshops to keep the conversation alive. Flyers handed out pamphlets at airports, urging travelers to speak up if they experienced unfair treatment. Social media campaigns encouraged people to share their Stories using hashtags like Chiron Fair Flights for All and Our Travel with Dignity. Every post, every tweet added fuel to the fire, keeping the pressure on airlines to do better. The auditor stayed involved, attending meetings with advocacy leaders and speaking at events when asked. He didn't seek the spotlight, but he understood the importance of lending his voice to the cause. At one such event, he stood before a packed room of activists, journalists, and concerned citizens. The energy in the room was electric. People were fired up, ready to keep pushing for change. "I didn't start this fight alone," he began, his tone calm but firm. "And we won't finish it alone either. This is about all of us. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel like they didn't belong because of the color of their skin, the way they dressed, or the seat they were assigned. We're here to say that those days are over." His words resonated deeply with the audience. Many nodded in agreement, some clapped, and a few even wiped away tears. For so long, they had felt powerless against a system that seemed stacked against them. Now they saw a path forward, a chance to demand respect and fairness. But the auditor didn't sugarcoat things. He reminded everyone that the road ahead would be tough. "Change doesn't come easy," he said. "There will be pushback. There will be excuses. Some people will try to dismiss this as a one-time thing or claim it's already been fixed. Don't let them fool you. Stay vigilant. Keep speaking out. Because if we don't hold them accountable, nothing will change." His message struck a chord, not just with those in the room but with people watching online. Clips of his speech went viral, inspiring countless others to join the movement. Teachers showed it to their students during lessons on social justice. Community leaders played it at local meetings to rally support. It became a rallying cry for anyone who believed in equality and fairness. Back at his office, the auditor received letters and emails from people thanking him for his work. Some shared personal stories of discrimination they had faced while traveling. Others expressed gratitude for giving them hope that things could improve. Reading through these messages filled him with a sense of purpose. He realized that while the fight was far from over, the collective effort was making a difference. One letter stood out to him. It was from a young girl no older than 10, who wrote about her dream of becoming a pilot someday. She said she loved airplanes and wanted to fly them when she grew up, but she also admitted she was scared, that she'd seen videos of people being treated poorly on flights and worried it might happen to her too. "Thank you for helping make flying fair for everyone," she wrote. "I want to be able to wear my uniform proudly one day and know I'll be treated with respect." The auditor read the letter several times, each word sinking in deeper than the last. Her innocence and determination reminded him why he did what he did. This wasn't just about adults feeling disrespected. It was about children dreaming big and needing to believe the world would welcome them. He tucked the letter into his desk drawer, where he kept reminders of why the work mattered. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Some airlines dragged their feet on implementing reforms, claiming financial difficulties or logistical hurdles. Others tried to downplay the severity of the issue, insisting that incidents of discrimination were rare exceptions rather than part of a broader pattern. But the auditor and his team weren't backing down. They continued monitoring compliance, conducting surprise inspections, and holding companies accountable whenever they fell short. At the same time, the auditor recognized the importance of celebrating small victories along the way. When an airline introduced new training programs for its staff, he acknowledged the effort publicly, encouraging others to follow suit. When a major carrier announced plans to revamp its complaint resolution process, he praised the move as a step in the right direction. Positive reinforcement, he believed, was just as important as calling out wrongdoing. By the end of the year, the landscape of air travel had begun to shift. Passengers reported feeling more respected and valued, though there was still work to be done. Advocacy groups remained active, ensuring that the momentum didn't fade. Lawmakers continued pushing for stronger protections, knowing that policies needed teeth to truly affect change. And the auditor? He kept doing what he did best, listening, observing, and fighting for fairness. Late one evening, as he packed up his briefcase to head home, he paused for a moment. The office was quiet, the hum of computers replaced by the soft glow of the desk lamp. He thought about everything that had happened, the investigations, the protests, the policy changes, and allowed himself a small smile. Progress wasn't perfect, but it was happening, and that, he decided, was worth every late night and every tough conversation. Tomorrow he would wake up and do it all again. Because in the end, this wasn't just about holding companies accountable. It was about creating a world where everyone could travel without fear of being treated unfairly. And that was a goal worth pursuing, no matter how hard the journey might be. The auditor sat in his hotel room late one evening, staring at the city skyline through the window. The lights twinkled like stars against the dark sky, a reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. It had been nearly a year since he first walked into that airport undercover, armed with nothing but a ticket and a mission. Now, the movement he helped ignite was bigger than anyone could have imagined. But as he reflected on everything that had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that this fight wasn't just about airlines. It was about something deeper. Months earlier, the Department of Transportation, DOT, had released its final report on the airline industry's discriminatory practices. The findings were clear. Systemic bias was not only real but pervasive. Airlines had been called out for everything from unfair seating arrangements to outright hostility toward certain passengers. Fines were levied, executives were fired, and new laws were passed to protect travelers. Yet despite these victories, the auditor knew the battle was far from over. Change doesn't happen overnight. Even as policies shifted and companies scrambled to clean up their image, old habits died hard. Some airlines tried to frame reforms as optional rather than mandatory, dragging their feet when it came to implementing meaningful changes. Others quietly cut corners, hoping no one would notice. The auditor and his team stayed vigilant, conducting random audits and holding companies accountable whenever they slipped up. It was exhausting work, but it was necessary. One day, while reviewing recent passenger feedback, the auditor stumbled upon a story that stopped him in his tracks. A young man wrote about his experience flying with a major carrier, the same airline, that had denied the auditor his first-class seat months ago. The young man described how he had been treated with respect throughout his journey, from check-in to landing. For once, he wrote, I felt like I belonged. Those simple words hit the auditor like a punch to the gut, not because they surprised him, but because they shouldn't have been remarkable. Everyone should feel like they belong when they travel. That this young man felt the need to point it out said more about the state of the world than any report ever could. It was moments like these that reminded the auditor why he kept going. He didn't do this work for recognition or applause. He did it because he believed in fairness. Because he believed that every person deserved to move through life without fear of being judged by the color of their skin or the seat they occupied. And because he believed that even small victories mattered, they added up, slowly chipping away at a system built on inequality. But the auditor also understood that change required more than just policy updates or corporate apologies. It required a shift in mindset, a willingness to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes. To drive this point home, he began working closely with advocacy groups to create educational programs for airline staff. These weren't your typical diversity training sessions filled with jargon and PowerPoint slides. Instead, they focused on storytelling, real stories from real passengers who had experienced discrimination firsthand. At one such session, the auditor stood before a group of flight attendants, pilots, and gate agents. He started by sharing his own experience of being denied access to first class simply because of how he looked. Then he invited others to speak, passengers who had faced similar treatment, as well as employees who admitted to making mistakes in the past. The room grew quiet as each person shared their story, the weight of their words sinking in. By the end of the session, something remarkable happened. People began talking, not just listening, but truly engaging with one another. Questions were asked, misconceptions were challenged, and connections were made. One flight attendant approached the auditor afterward, tears in her eyes. I never realized how my actions might affect someone, she confessed. Thank you for helping me see things differently. Moments like these gave the auditor hope. Change wasn't just about rules or regulations, it was about empathy, about understanding that behind every ticket number was a human being with dreams, fears, and dignity. And if enough people embraced that idea, maybe, just maybe, the world could become a little kinder. As the months went by, the movement continued to grow. Advocacy groups expanded their efforts beyond air travel, tackling discrimination in other areas of transportation. Buses, trains, taxis, all became part of the conversation. Lawmakers introduced broader legislation aimed at protecting passengers across the board. Social media campaigns kept the pressure on, reminding companies that accountability wasn't optional. For the auditor, the journey was bittersweet. On one hand, he took pride in what had been accomplished. The airline industry was far from perfect, but it was better than it had been. Passengers reported feeling more respected, and companies were starting to prioritize inclusivity in ways they hadn't before. On the other hand, he knew there was still so much work to be done. Discrimination wasn't limited to air travel. It existed everywhere, woven into the fabric of society itself. Fixing one problem wouldn't fix them all. Still, the auditor refused to let himself get discouraged. Every step forward mattered, no matter how small. Every policy change, every act of kindness, every voice raised in protest brought them closer to justice. And while he couldn't solve every problem, he could focus on the ones within reach. One morning, as he prepared for yet another trip, the auditor packed his suitcase with care. Inside, along with his clothes and toiletries, was a folder filled with notes, reports, and letters from people whose lives had been touched by his work. Among them was the letter from the young girl who dreamed of becoming a pilot. He carried it with him wherever he went, a reminder of why he kept fighting. As he boarded the plane, he took a moment to look around. Passengers of all ages, races, and backgrounds filled the seats, chatting quietly or scrolling through their phones. For a brief second, he allowed himself to imagine a future where none of them would ever have to worry about being treated unfairly because of who they were. It was an ambitious dream, perhaps even naive, but it was also worth striving for. The auditor settled into his seat, leaning back as the plane taxied down the runway. Outside, the sun was rising, casting golden light across the horizon. It was a new day full of possibilities, and though the road ahead would undoubtedly be long and challenging, he was ready to face it head-on. Because in the end, this wasn't just about holding companies accountable. It was about creating a world where everyone could travel freely, safely, and with dignity. And that was a goal worth pursuing, no matter how hard the journey might be.